I declare this meeting of the Port Phillip City Council open, and I welcome members of the public that are here tonight. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Willam clan of the Boonwurrung. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge and uphold their traditional relationship to this land. Council has a local law that determines how this meeting will be conducted. There is a time allotted in tonight's agenda for public question time, and during public question time, members of the public can ask specific questions on general matters other than those relating to a topic that's on tonight's agenda. Members of the public are only to ask a specific question and shall not provide any statement or contextual comments relating to that question. Consequently, the official minutes of the meeting will only record the question asked and any response given. The number of questions that a member of the public may ask shall be at the discretion of the chairperson. There's also an opportunity for members of the public to ask a question or make a comment on a specific item on tonight's agenda, and this will be done prior to Council considering the item. We encourage questions or comments from the public that are directed through the Mayor, are not defamatory, abusive or objectionable in language or substance, but rather are presented in a spirit of mutual respect of the Council and the community. And we ask all speakers to abide by the directions of the Chair. If you wish to ask a question or speak to a report, please complete the blue form that's available at the table just outside the chamber and hand it to a staff member. And I encourage you to limit your questions and comments to 3 minutes and to avoid repeating any comments that have already been made by other speakers. And please note, all council meetings are now being live streamed. Live streaming and recording allows the community to watch and to listen to meetings in real time, providing greater access to council decision-making and debate, and improving openness and transparency. The live stream of this meeting is available on Council's website, and the recording of this meeting will also be available to view a few days after the meeting on Council's website and YouTube channel. The cameras will film and record councillors at this meeting. However, care is taken not to film or record images of members of the public. If a member of the public asks a question or makes a comment about an agenda item, they will not be filmed, but their voice will be heard in the live stream and it will be recorded. And please note, in accordance with Council's local law, that this meeting cannot be filmed or audio taped unless permission is granted by the Mayor. In the unlikely event of an emergency evacuation, please follow the instructions of the Chief Warden. Okay, we'll move to the agenda. So item 1, apologies. Councillors, we're all here, so there's no apologies. Item 2, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. Councillors, the minutes of the ordinary meeting held on the 4th of July 2018 have been circulated. Are there any questions relating to these minutes? If not, can I have a motion confirming those minutes? Councillor Bond to move, Councillor Simic to second. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Item 3, which is the declarations of conflicts of interest. Does anyone have a conflict of interest in a matter being discussed at tonight's meeting? Councillor Simic?
I, Councillor Oggie Simic, declare that in relation to item 9.4, Community Grants Program 2018-19, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 3, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by the way of an indirect interest because of a close association.
Thank you, Councillor Simic. Councillor Pearl.
I, Councillor Marcus Pearl. I, Councillor Marcus Pearl, declare that in relation to item 9.3 Community Grants Program 2018-19, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 2, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of indirect interest by close association.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl. And Councillor Bond.
I, Councillor Andrew Bond, declare that in relation to item 9.2 Community Grants Program 2018-19, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 1, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of an indirect interest by close association.
Thank you, councillors. At the appropriate time, I'll ask you to raise that again and then leave the room. We'll move to item 4. Councillors, we've got 2 petitions on tonight's agenda. I'll go to 4.1 first of all, which is the petition regarding TT Buckingham Reserve, and we don't have any speakers to that petition. Councillors, do you have any questions for the officers in relation to this petition? There are none. We've got an officer's Do you have a question, Councillor? You would like to move the officer's recommendation. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Copsey? Councillor Bond? No. Would anybody else like to speak to the motion? If not, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Item 4.2, which is the petition regarding renaming of Newton Court Reserve, St Kilda. And councillors, we have 3 speakers that have requested to speak to this item. I'll now call upon Maureen Hickey, please. You'd like to change the order? Miss Anna Griffiths, thank you.
Madam Mayor, can I just raise a small typo in our notes here? It says renaming of Newton Court, St Kilda. It's actually the renaming of Newton Court Reserve.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bond. We'll make a note of that. Welcome, Ms Griffiths. If you'd state your name and suburb and actually put on the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for the welcome. I'm one of the signatories to the document, the petition to the renaming of Newton Court St Kilda in honour of Father Ernie Smith, the founder of the Sacred Heart Mission in Grey Street.
Ms Griffiths, if you would state your name and your suburb, please, for the record. Thank you.
My name's Anna Griffiths. I live in St Leonard's Avenue, St Kilda. Councillors, I believe you have been poorly served by the document, this document briefing you as to whether or not to support this petition. I'd just like to correct one very misleading statement in which the writer of the document says that Father Ernie Smith played a major role in the establishment of the Sacred Heart Mission. He did not merely play a major role. He was the founder and the establisher and absolutely dedicated proponent of setting up services to cater for the poor and needy of the people in this St Kilda in 1982 when he was appointed parish priest. With the cooperation and great support of his parishioners, he realised that something needed to be done practically to look after these needy people. When he came to St Kilda, his accommodation was in a big fancy red brick house dating back to about 1919, I think, next door to the church. When that house was built, the people on the St Kilda Hill were very prosperous, as you can tell by the type of residents that still dot that area of St Kilda, or much of St Kilda. By the time Father Ernie went to the mission, those houses had largely been broken up into poky little flats that were virtually uninhabitable, many of them, or they were completely homeless. Ernie responded to the requests for people coming to the presbytery every morning asking for cups of tea or for a chat or some other form of support. And he moved into a rather decrepit house next door and dedicated the whole of the presbytery to those people's needs, various rooms and administration, as his army of volunteers grew and some employees were also able to join him. By 1982, the suburb he came to was nothing like the one for which those grand buildings were built. Also, the neighbouring buildings, the school and the hall, were gradually taken over by the mission with the full cooperation of the parish. His legacy lives on, as you know, in the mission. Excuse me. I need not explain the extent and breadth of the services offered by the Sacred Heart Mission. I ask you to find it in your hearts to look through and beyond the mean words of the document in front of you, and consider your response carefully to the local petition to rename a tiny park, a tiny reserve next to the church in the honour of this great man. I also take issue to a certain extent that you're being asked to consider this mission according to item H, which says that Father Smith should be established as having had the support of a significant majority of the community. The person who wrote this document appears to believe that's not the case. I would argue that he has enormous support in the community. He died recently, and his memory lives on. He lives on in the hearts of many local people and in thousands of people who have been through the doors of his mission. So I would like you to please consider this petition carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Griffiths. Ms Hickey, would you like to go now, or would you like to?
Julia would like to go next.
Julia Topless, please. Welcome.
Thank you. My name's Julia Topless. I live in Grey Street, St Kilda. I speak to you today as a resident of Grey Street, St Kilda, for 19 years and a member of Rotary International for 10 years, 3 years of which I served as president of the Rotary Club of St Kilda, the same club that Father Ernie Smith was a member of during his time as parish priest of Sacred Heart Mission. I wish to raise my voice in support of members of the St Kilda community who wish to see some monument created to memorize Ernie Smith and his contribution to our community. To many of our community, Ernie was a friend, a guide and a sponsor. He taught us compassion, kindness and generosity of spirit. He is one of a few in the city of Port Phillip who have made a significant contribution to our community. We all understand that allegations have been made against Father Ernie. The details of these allegations have not been made available for public record. Only the ruling of the Archdiocese of Melbourne have been put forward. What we do know is that allegations were raised in 2005 and 2006 by 2 women, and that at that time the Archdiocese deemed them not actionable. A third allegation was raised in November 2017, which prompted the Archdiocese to take action under the Melbourne response and to deem Ernie no longer a priest of good standing. Technically, this means that Ernie is still to be considered a priest and deserving still of the title of father. In all cases bar one, the women were of legal age, with one woman being 17 years of age at the time. Indications are that these issues occurred prior to Father Ernie becoming the parish priest of St Kilda, being over 36 years ago. At the time of the final complaint, Father Ernie was incredibly sick, in the final stages of his battle with Parkinson's disease, a disease that affects movement, cognitive ability and speech. At Father Ernie's funeral, which I attended, over 30 of his peers presided at his Mass, including the Right Reverend Peter Hollingworth, former Anglican Bishop and Governor-General of Australia. At the Mass, these spiritual leaders voiced their disapproval and anger at the church hierarchy and its treatment of Father Ernie. My guess, based on the statement made at the funeral, is that the consensus amongst these church leaders are: 1, the church left their action to a time when Father Ernie was no longer able to defend himself suitably, or, as I heard from people close to Ernie's family, at a time when he was cognitively incapable of understanding the allegations, although the church had knowledge and capability for over 12 years to action accordingly, but chose not to. 2, the complaints against Father Ernie have not been lodged with the police, and with the current knowledge of these matters do not represent an illegal activity under the laws of Australia. 3, a general frustration of the lack of due process within the church hierarchy. Finally, the law of Australia is based on the Westminster system. At the heart of this system is the separation of church and state. It is also a system that states we are all innocent until proven guilty. As such, I request that you review the request of the St Kilda community based on the law of our country and not of the Catholic Church. I ask that you consider that Ernie Smith, our neighbour, made a significant contribution to our community, that his work in our community for over 20 years impacted thousands of lives. He influenced a key part of St Kilda and its cultural flavour, and he was responsible for creating a spiritual hub that supported some of the most disadvantaged in our community. In short, he was a friend to everyone, no matter where you came from or what you had been through. Father Ernie taught us all compassion, kindness and generosity of spirit. I ask you to adopt these principles in your consideration of the St Kilda community's request. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Topless. And Ms Maureen Hickey, please.
My name is Maureen Hickey, 47 Rome Street, St Kilda. I have no need to remind you, I think, that you are here to exercise your independent statutory obligations as our representatives. You are representative of constituents and you are there by virtue of a democratic process. Part of that democracy is the separation of church and state, and that is of profound significance, and I'll return to that later on. I don't want to traverse the material that was circulated in connection with the petition, nor the paper that was circulated responding to Councillor Bond's concerns about the action taken by the Cathedral against Ernie Smith. Instead, I want to dwell upon the officer's recommendation and the basis for that recommendation, because they introduce an entirely new and very worrying aspect into this whole matter. That recommendation refers to, if I can take you to it, background information. It refers to the criteria for the assessment of naming and requires significant community support. It then appends to that a press release from that Sacred Heart mission dated February. Now, that press release in turn truncates and repeats the letter of the Archbishop, the former Archbishop of Melbourne, of the 1st of February. That letter refers to the processes taken against Father Ernie Smith, and it was quite clear there are two separate processes. And the one he is primarily dealing with is that conducted by Mr Gleeson. It's pompously referred to as a Melbourne response. In point of fact, it is simply an in-house procedure. It is undertaken by a barrister in private practice engaged by the Archbishop or the Archdiocese and paid by it. In no sense is it independent, in no sense at all. The Archbishop and the Archdiocese has a primary interest in the whole process because it operates to protect church assets. And it does that by placing a ceiling of compensation and by requiring participants therein to sign non-disclosure and non-litigation agreements. The Archbishop's letter is clear that the subsequent process undertaken by Gleeson in 2017 and 18 was done at a time when Ernie Smith was in hospital dying from Parkinson's disease and dementia. Notwithstanding that, the letter alleges that Mr Smith, Father Smith, accepted the allegations. He was in no condition to accept anything. So that is a myth. In point of fact, the procedure was a perversion of the notion of due justice, due process. And yet, what is appended to the officer's recommendation is what the Sacred Heart mission, its press release, and that truncates the Archbishop's letter. But it's quite clear that the source of that is the Archbishop's letter. The Archbishop is not a member of our local community, and his views do not represent the views of the community. The only evidence you have for the views of the local community are the names attached to the petition, and there are roughly 100 of those. That's the evidence you have. And yet that is ignored. That is ignored by the officer. The officer fails to deal with the fact that, in addition to renaming, the petition requests a bench be dedicated to the memory of Ernie Smith.
Please come to the end.
Sorry?
Please come to the end. That's been 3 minutes.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Please come to the end. That's been 3 minutes.
I'm just coming there now. But if I can go back now to the matter of church and state, if you accept the officer's recommendation on the basis in which it is advanced, what you are doing is accepting uncritically a view emanating from an outside source, that is the former Archbishop of Melbourne, who is not a constituent, he is not a member of the local community, and his views do not represent the views of the local community. You are therefore, if you accept this recommendation, you are breaching the separation of church and state. And I urge you very strongly not to go down that path. This is a very serious concern. And it only rises because of the officer's recommendation and the basis on which it is put. In those circumstances, what I most urgently put to you is that what you should be doing is deferring this matter for further and better consideration to obtain what is the community view about this? What is the significant community attitude towards this? You have the means at your disposal to do that. Use them. Do not go down the path of breaching the separation between church and state. This is the most
Thank you. We've heard you loud and clear. Thank you very much. Councillors, that's the end of the public requesting to speak. Do you have any questions of the officers on this item? Councillor Crawford.
So I guess I've got a couple of questions. So the first thing, if for some reason the petition were to go ahead, is the process then to take the consult on renaming of the reserve to the wider community or to the ward? And so it wouldn't just be on the names in the petition that would be valid in this instance. Can I ask that first to be the question?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the process would be, if Council chose to progress the matter further, is that we would firstly speak with the Office of Geographic Names around. They run checks like duplication checks, amongst other things. We would then undertake a period of community consultation. That would involve some of Council's traditional means of consulting with the community through Have Your Say, also advertising in local newspapers. In addition, there would be notification to residents and property owners within a certain distance to the actual park, as well as consultation with Indigenous groups and owners. The results of that consultation would then be brought back to Council for your consideration, and that consultation would be based on the principles within the naming rules which are set by the state government.
And just as a follow-up question, is there a minimum criteria of the kind of votes for or against? So if there is a certain percentage of the community that are for or against, is that part of what the Office of Geographical Names would say you couldn't go ahead with?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so there would need to be a majority of support amongst those that were responding through those formal mechanisms to move forward with the proposal.
Thank you, Ms Bennett. One more.
I just have one more question. Given some sensitivity around these topics, either raised, whether they're valid or not, the conflicting information that you as officers have received, is there any criteria that the Office of Geographical Names would that would be something that would be of issue to them if there is conflicting views, whether they are valid or not in the community?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that would be something we would need to take on notice and discuss further with the Office Registrar.
Councillor Baxter.
Just going back to the idea that you'd be looking for a majority view from the community. What kind of majority are we talking here? Are we talking 50% plus one vote, or an overwhelming majority? I really haven't seen something like this before, to be honest.
Through you, Madam Mayor, so it would need to be enough to demonstrate significant community support. So whatever you would set, but I would suggest 60+% consultation feedback responses as a minimum.
Thank you, Ms Bennett. Anyone else that has a question? Councillor Brand.
Yes, I just want to check with officers about the position and opinion of Sacred Heart Mission itself on this issue. They released a press release in February 2018, and which is part of the documentation on the minutes on the item, and I just want to check whether that is actually confirmed as their current position or whether there's been any change in it since that was released.
Ms Bennett.
Through you, Madam Mayor, officers have spoken with Sacred Heart, including the CEO as recently as today, to confirm that the position as outlined in the media statement remains the position from the CEO's perspective.
One question from me, Ms Bennett. If Council were of a mind to accept the officer's recommendation, is there anything in this recommendation that would preclude this coming back to Council for a decision in some time when perhaps this might be a bit easier?
Through you, Madam Mayor, if councillors were to pass the officer's recommendation, it wouldn't preclude further consideration at some point into the future if new information became available.
Councillor Crawford.
And I just want to clarify, because I'm not familiar with all the rules, there is no ruling of how long someone needs to have passed for before they are actually named after. There's not a time period, because often it is quite a time period before people get things named after them.
Through you, Madam Mayor, there isn't a specific time frame per se, but in most instances it's usually around 12 months after the person has passed. That would typically be the approach, but there is no formalised amount of time.
Okay, any other questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Pearl to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond.
Could I foreshadow a motion should it lose?
Yes, Councillor.
Sorry, I should.
It's a little late, but you can during your speech anyway, but I'll accept that. Councillor Pearl, would you like to speak to the motion? So you reserve your right. Yes, Councillor Bond.
This is, one of those difficult decisions that we often have to make here at Council. There's no doubt that Father Ernie Smith did some terrific work by establishing the Sacred Heart mission, and the work he established lives on through to the present day. But given the circumstances over the last couple of years, with the amount of publicity through the recent Royal Commission and otherwise, I just feel it's probably inappropriate to start naming things after priests, the Catholic priests in particular, and I say that as a Catholic. Maybe in a few years' time, when things have settled and more is known about the circumstances of not just Father Ernie Smith, but everything that has occurred within the Catholic Church over the last few years, out of respect for the fact that it is very raw for so many people, and we as councillors sit up here not knowing the circumstances around what happened. I don't know of anyone who does know the full circumstances. I'm sure someone does, but maybe at a more appropriate time in the future, the terrific work of Father Ernie Smith could be recognised somehow. I just don't feel that now is the appropriate time to do so. And I also feel it would need to have the support of Sacred Heart Mission in order for us to progress something in the memory of Father Ernie Smith. And it's clear that at this point in time, Sacred Heart Mission don't support the naming of anything in honour of Father Ernie Smith at the moment. So very difficult for us to go against their wishes and against the current environment surrounding what has occurred in the Catholic Church. So therefore, I'll be supporting the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Councillor Gross.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I'd like to speak and foreshadow that I would be moving a motion very similar to the officer's recommendation. The Council receives and notes the petition. The Council lets the petition lie on the table for a year. 3, that thanks the petitioner for their request and notifies them of this resolution. This municipality has two dissident priests who we have to recognise in the fullness of time. These dissident priests have been incredibly productive and have epitomised what I understand to be the spirit of Jesus in reaching out to the poor. These two men are both flawed and controversial individuals. Of course, I'm talking about Father Ernie and Father Bob. Both have had almost intractable fights with the cathedral, and the cathedral has stepped in to end the career of Father Bob in his parish and to make certain statements about Father Ernie. And as Councillor Bond says, this is a very difficult issue. But I come to this debate with certain personal views. My first view is I want to thank the officers for their recommendation, because I think it was the only recommendation they could make on the evidence of the views of the Catholic Church and Sacred Heart. So I have no truck with the officers, and I congratulate them for their report. Secondly, I don't need to reiterate the extraordinary contribution of Father Ernie. I only met him a few times, but one thing really resonates with me with his talk about housing. And he said to me, when I came here, Dick, there were 100 people sleeping rough in this municipality, was then St Kilda, and that need not happen. And indeed, under his watch, it didn't happen, because the council was the council that embarked on the social housing crusade of the 80s and 90s, and Sacred Heart Mission was begun. And we're still talking about those issues today. His relevance hasn't diminished one bit. I've spoken to several Catholic priests in preparation for tonight, and one lay leader in the Catholic Church. And it is clear that on some perspectives, on the Orthodox Catholic perspective, Father Ernie was triumphantly flawed in that he had a consensual relationship with a mature woman, which he even wrote about in his own book, and that might be regarded by some Orthodox practitioners as a breaking of his vows. I echo the observations of the Royal Commission that say that it's an incredibly important reform that could alleviate some of the sexual abuse issues that has plagued the Catholic Church in recent decades. So, you know, that crime isn't a crime, in my view. The others, well, we don't have the forensic training or capability to find out the truth, even if we had an open look at the files. We don't have the training. Father Ernie is dead, and Father Ernie's faculties were so diminished at the time that the inquiry occurred that it was impossible to have a free and fair inquiry. On this, Ms Hickey and I absolutely agree. So I find it quite an emotional thing for this community to embrace. Some of our heroes have to be embraced, warts and all, and sometimes those warts will prohibit any acclamation or recognition by the community. One thing I have to say is that Father Ernie was not a pedophile. The people I've spoken to said that all of his relationships at the time were consensual. The question is, were they appropriate and of equal power? Of that I cannot say, and no one can say. So my feeling is that, and I spoke to one woman who said, listen, I'd never liked Ernie, but geez, he did an amazing job and we have to recognise him. But it's too early at the moment. So my view is that we take cognizance of these almost 100 people who've come out and said we need to recognise Father Early, and I think we also take cognizance that this is a complicated and difficult and morally ambiguous situation, and I think we just let it lay on the table for a year. I accept that mine, in one sense, isn't a foreshadowed motion because Councillor Bond's and Councillor Pearl's motion could get up and it still could come back to us in a year. So it's not exactly opposing your resolution, but I'm putting it out there as an opportunity for us to take a longer, slow and measured view about what this brilliant, irascible, complicated man did for this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Crawford, you have a clarifying question? Yes, you can ask a clarifying question of the officers. Councillor Brand.
I'd just like to know the notion of laying it on the table, leaving the petition laying on the table for a year. What is the technical difference in that from saying it could come back any time?
Ms Bennett, are you able to describe for everyone what laying it on the table means?
Through you, Madam Mayor, so if Council were to resolve to lay the matter on the table, it means that it would still be an open resolution of the Council and could be brought back up before the Council by merely moving a motion to lift it off of the table. So if you as a Council were to resolve, which you're able to do under your local laws, to lay the matter on the table, then that could be lifted at any time by a councillor from a procedural sense.
Thank you, Ms Bennett. Councillor Crawford.
I don't think this petition or the discussion tonight or the recommendation is about lack of recognition. I think that's, we're all shades of grey, and there is, the recognition actually lives on day to day in what the work the Sacred Heart Mission does. It's a matter of timing. And I think it is upon us, or from my perspective, there is sensitivities in the air, in the wider community, to the pendulum has swung around with royal commissions and Me Too movement, and there's a whole lot of things going on, there's a whole lot of change, which makes people very sensitive to complex and historical issues as well as current ones. So I think this matter is about bringing it back, and I may differ to Councillor Gross on this, that I don't know if it's a year, I don't know if it's 2 years, it may be 5, I'm not sure. I can't read the cards that far ahead. But I do know in the current climate that taking it out to public consultation, I worry, will have more blowback on Sacred Heart Mission and the work they do, and perhaps on Father Ernie Smith himself in ways that we can't expect. So I think the best thing we can do is keep supporting, and as we do on council and in our local community, the great work that the Sacred Heart Mission does with the vulnerable, and that is recognising his work every day, and that this petition should come back to us at a time that is less sensitive and more appropriate, and it can be given the unsullied, perhaps, discussion that may occur in the wider community, and that his great work in this community can be recognised just quite simply and not get caught up in the many other complex things that are happening in the wider environment, particularly in the Catholic Church. So I will be supporting the officer's motion, and I do look forward to a time when perhaps Sacred Mission come on board and there is a less sensitive time that we can bring his this acknowledgement to the fore. But in the meantime, the day-to-day work we do at council and in the community, I think, speaks to his ongoing legacy.
Councillor Baxter.
So, first off, I want to thank all the petitioners for coming in and bringing us this tricky problem. It is extraordinarily complex for many of the reasons that Councillor Gross went into, and I won't continue to go into them. What I think the purpose of the petition here, as Councillor Crawford said, is not about recognising Father Smith. I think the petition is actually an attempt to get council to do something to help rehabilitate Father Smith's reputation, which has been tarnished either fairly or unfairly. I'm not going to get into any of that, but I think that the only thing that will actually be able to rehabilitate an image that has been tarnished by letters and by decisions is actually through the community. I think that has to happen first, and I do think that, I was considering whether maybe we just chuck it out to community consultation, see what people think. But I think that there are a lot of people who are deeply informed about every step of this process, and there are a lot of people who aren't particularly informed by it. They've just read some stuff in the paper and they may make submissions based on that. And I think that this is actually something that the community needs to come together on, and those people who want to rehabilitate Father Smith's image need to do so out there in the community and make sure that people are informed of every aspect, warts and all, of this before people can come to a decision that makes sense. So I think that I don't know whether we'll come back in the future and look at something. It's obvious that Father Smith was a remarkable man for a number of different reasons. It's also obvious that that there were flaws. The true extent of those, again, I'm not really wanting to go into. Another thing that's true is that many governments, federal, state and local, have raised monuments to far worse people. Genocidal sorts of people. And I'm very much against that as well. So I think that we need to all take stock and really have a think about this. I'm not equating Father Smith to Captain Cook, by the way. I'm just making a point. And I think that the conversation has really only just started, and I don't think council's role comes in until the community has actually come closer to the close of that conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Councillor Brand.
Yes, it's a difficult question, and I think it warrants the time that we're taking to discuss it, talk it through. My position is actually close to Councillor Baxter's. I think that ultimately it's a community responsibility to sort out the name and the reputation and the likelihood and the suitability of the proposal under the basic criterion that we have to use as a starting point of widespread community enthusiasm for the proposal. I mean, that's just a basic starting point, and it's not for us through a naming process to try to work out the rights or wrongs or the rehabilitation or the whatever of the situation. When there's a clear community view and attitude, we will be delighted to act on that. Father Smith was obviously an incredible person that did such important work for the whole community of St Kilda and way beyond. Sacred Heart Mission itself is probably the single most important care institution in the city, the most emblematic of it, of all the work that is done in that direction in their city. And people love it and revere it. And the mission is Ernie Smith's major monument, most obviously and evidently. I know people who've moved to St Kilda because Sacred Heart is there, and its spirit of looking after the marginalised and actually dealing with the issues of a whole community rather than sweeping them under the carpet. It's integral with the whole concept of St Kilda, in my view. The problem is that Sacred Heart Mission really is working the other way on this particular issue, wanting not to commemorate Father Smith's name, at least at this time. And I don't think that we can in any way assume the community wouldn't be highly influenced by that. It's highly influenced by Sacred Heart in so many other ways. I'm sure the vast majority, well, not the vast, a very real proportion of the community would be led by that position. And I think that it's a hopeless task at the moment to think that general community, a large majority acceptance, popularity of the idea would ever emerge until that can be sorted out. And I think that is for the community, the parishioners, the petitioners, and Sacred Heart and everybody else in the community to actually work at sorting that out by researching it more, sorting it out, discussing, clarifying. When that happens, our door is open to that. I think personally, I feel he obviously needs to be memorialised. But at the moment, I don't think we're in a position to do that. And I really support the officer's recommendation. I just don't quite see the point of laying it on the table for a year. I don't know why it would be a year. It comes to the same thing. When the time is right, we will look at it again. If and when the time is right, in terms of that first hurdle of general community acceptance, we will be ready to look again. And I look forward to that day. But at the moment, I think what we're really doing is a deferral just by declining to accept it. It just defers it until there's a better moment and more support. And in a way, this petition is the first stage in that process. The community needs to work on it until then, and I personally hope that it does come back with better circumstances packed around it. And that's the way I'll be voting.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak? Then I'll ask Councillor Pearl to close.
Councillor Bond, Councillor Brand and Councillor Baxter have summarised this up pretty well, councillors. I think it's fair to say that it's too soon, given what's been happening recently and the knowledge that this council has on the table in front of us. I shook Councillor Gross's hand after his speech, not because I agreed necessarily with everything within it, but it shows the depth of thought and the breadth of research which he has done to come to a very solid conclusion in his mind. And the people in the gallery here tonight should have confidence in the level of seriousness that councillors, particularly the ward councillors, have taken in considering this issue. I would encourage everyone to accept the officer's recommendation here this evening. Again, there's two sides to every story, and in the public domain, I haven't heard both those sides of the story, nor am I one to be able to sit here in judgment over somebody of Father Smith's record. However, I would say that any memorial that's put in place in the future needs to be done under the correct circumstances and needs to be done right. If it's done right, it won't ever be questioned again in the future, and that's the most important thing. We hear your voice and we hear the passion in which you speak, and all of us would collectively thank you for coming and putting the effort and the time to articulate what you've done here this evening, and we greatly appreciate what you've done. and thank you for coming and putting your views forward. But councillors, I would strongly support you to accept the officer's recommendation here tonight, and let, in the fullness of time, perhaps we will reconsider this issue in the future, but I don't think now is the appropriate time to be doing that.
Thank you, Councillor Pearl, and I will put that motion. All those in favour? All those against? That motion's carried. Now we'll move on to item 5, which is the sealing schedule, and councillors, we don't have any documents that requiring sealing. Item 6, which is public question time, and we have one member of the public that's requested to speak. I'd like to ask Mr Isaac Herman to come forward. Welcome, Mr Herman.
Good evening, everyone. Isaac Herman from Elwood. If I may, 2 brief questions. Firstly, really a well done to Council on meeting Elwood resident requirements for Tide Street so far. In truth, Tide Street should only be considered a little track, though is proving to be a long and slightly bumpy road. It is not complete. The extension of the nature reserve at the Wave Street end, at the rear of 19 Wave Street, has not taken place. And I'd like to know when will that come about. This local improvement, included in the Elwood Canal Master Plan of 1998, along with a raft of other improvements, was forgotten. I have provided Council with a detailed list of these measures and again request that they be implemented. What is Council to do?
And your second question, and then we might answer them both together if we can. Thank you.
The second question concerns our foreshore. I'd like to know who, how, what, where and when will the ongoing loss of thousands of square metres of our shoreline at Point Ormond and MO Moran Reserve be addressed. Madam Mayor and councillors, CEO and officers, our municipality is now smaller than when you received it. A couple more southwesterly gales and not only will land but infrastructure will be at risk.
Thank you, Mr Herman. Yes, and then Miss Blair, is it? Or Miss Jeffs? I'm not sure who's going to ask. Oh, Miss Rosick? And while she's
Mr
getting a
Herman,
microphone.
can I ask you just to talk about the evidence of the erosion and the extent of the erosion on, say, Point Ormond?
The erosion is between the concrete pedestrian footpath and what was the sea wall, which is sort of largely disintegrated and tumbled into the sea. In essence, it was a rubble a wall constructed of rubble and bluestone blocks. A lot of all that area is landfill and prone to severe erosion, always has been. And the evidence, I think you've got, I've looked at photographic evidence. I worked day in, day out in that area in the 1980s. We used to drive trucks along that stretch. Now there is 1 metre to 0 distance basically between the sea and the pedestrian footpath.
Thanks.
Ms Rosick, are you able to answer both of those questions?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the first question about what's happening in Tide Street in relation to the matters you raised and the earlier commitment, I'll have to take that on notice. In regards to the inundation and erosion, I'll have to take that on notice, in particular to the location that was mentioned. However, I just wanted to add that in the Act and Adapt Sustainable Environment Strategy, we do have an action that does pertain to sea level rise, which is to assess the recommendations from the state-led coastal vulnerability assessment and develop an implementation strategy and action plan to help protect the City of Port Phillip against sea level rise and inundation. And we're also looking at use of blue-green infrastructure. So there are some actions that pertain to that matter, but specifically in relation to Tide Street, I'll have to take that on notice and get back to Council.
Thank you, Ms Rosick. Thank you, Mr Herman. Okay, so that concludes public question time. Now we'll move to councillor question time. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? No? Then we'll move to presentation of reports. So item 9, the community grants, the awarding of the community grants. Just before I start, we don't have any members of the public that have requested to speak, but we do have some. No, there's no one to speak. So we'll move to item 9.1 first up. There's no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Bond to move. Councillor Pearl to second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Pearl, would anyone else? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Now we'll move to item 9.2. And who is it that has it?
I, Councillor Andrew Bond, declare that in relation to item 9.2, Community Grants Program 2018-19, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 1, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of an indirect interest by close association.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. We'll call you back in shortly. Mr Chick will escort you out of the chambers. Councillors. Do you have any questions of the officers on this particular item, 9.2? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover on that? Councillor Gross and Councillor Crawford to second. Would you like to speak on the item?
Just to thank you for the work that's been done on this report. It's it's really persuasive and really good, and I don't wish to alter any of the recommendations.
Councillor Crawford.
I'll just speak quickly, being on the committee that helped award these. I do think it's really exciting to acknowledge that the breadth of the type of overall community grants that we're giving, because what amazed me is the extent of the kind of volunteer and great works that happen within our community, and they are really all sorts of things that you wouldn't imagine. And it's all about connecting our community, building the strength in our community, and looking out for the vulnerable. And yeah, I just think it's a thumbs up. We are a city that volunteers, and we could always do with more, but it is actually really heartening to be able to award these grants so the good work continues.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? If not, I will put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Call Mr Councillor Bond back in, and Councillor Pearl.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I, Councillor Marcus Pearl, declare that in relation to item 9.3, Community Grants Program 2018-2019, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 2, that I have a conflict of interest in this matter by way of indirect interest by close association.
Terrific, thank you. We'll call you back in shortly as well. Now, councillors, do you have any questions in relation to 9.3 of the officers? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Copsey to move, Councillor Simic to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Simic? Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Crawford?
I just noticed one of our esteemed panel members is still in the audience, and I want to thank Phillip for your assistance and your advice and insight, because we had some really great community members who know far more than Councillor Pearl and I, and it was very valuable to have your insight.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. I'm doing it again. Okay, well then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. Well done. Thank you. Call Councillor Pearl back in. And for 9.4?
I, Councillor Oggy Simic, declare that in relation to item 9.4, Community Grants Program 2018-19, recommendations for funding Supplementary Report 3, that I have a conflict of interest in the matter by way of indirect interest because of a close association, and that association being that I'm a member of the Elwood Playgroup Incorporated and that my son attends there.
Thank you very much, Councillor Simic. It's fun kicking everyone out tonight. Council. Yes, it's a joyous moment. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers on 9.4? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Pearl to move and Councillor Baxter to second. Councillor Pearl, would you like to speak? Councillor Baxter, would anyone else like to speak?
Oh, no, I would like to.
Oh, apologies.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, well, probably not. Well, I just wanted to clarify for anybody watching at home, the reason this has been split up is because a number of councillors are involved with lots of different groups, as is usual with community-minded people, and so they will tend to have a conflict if a grant is awarded to that group, and so we've split it up so that only those sections where someone has a conflict will be considered that way. So just in case anybody didn't know, that's why we did that. I thought I might just very clearly say that. And also just to say that, just like Councillor Crawford, these are all really great to see come to fruition. So.
Thank you. And I'll also just wrap up and say, wanted to congratulate the organisations that have received funding through this process. The officers have done a fantastic job. Thank you very much. The committee's done a wonderful job in, selecting from 71 applications, 44 organisations. It's whittled down to funding of $281 $1,000 that's actually available to spread. So I'd also like to acknowledge the councillors that sat on that committee and waded through all those reports as well. So well done to everyone. Good job, and hopefully we see some fantastic projects that sort of come out of this process. All right, then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Okay, that's the end of 9.1. We can ask Councillor Simic to come back in now. And we will go to 11.1, which is Elster Creek Catchment 2018 Action Plan, Quarter 2 update. And we've got two members of the public that have requested to speak. Mr Isaac Herman, please.
Mayor,
Mr Herman.
Isaac Herman from Elwood. Now that Melbourne Water has made it clear that it is producing a flood management plan for the entire Elster Creek catchment, together with the City of Port Phillip officers, when, if ever, does it intend to facilitate any community consultations? I believe 2 community consultations were promised around last November that did not eventuate. And when will our other several catchments also have a flood management plan? Or does Council not consider other flooding on its very doorstep to be of similar concern? This is not the first time that I'm asking this question and haven't as yet received a response. As for the Elster Creek Action Plan update, I can see that many reports have been undertaken and indeed completed. This update provides a lovely silhouette of activity. There is next to no content provided. Please provide the actual contents of the completed deliverables 1, 2, 3, 3B, 8, 10A and 13A. Without the contents, there is no transparency. Without the contents, there is no community consultative process, which, as per deliverable 11, whose purpose is to deliver consultation, that has not yet been delivered. I do note, however, the first installation of one-way valves along the Elwood Canal and express my deep satisfaction and gratitude to our local ward councillors and the councillor in its entirety that supported this measure that was suggested in a report authored by none other than the esteemed engineer Carlo Catani in 1904. This Friday, as you may know, will be the 100-year anniversary of his passing, and a small ceremony will be held at Brighton Cemetery at 10:30 a.m, and all are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Herman, and thanks for that public notice. That's terrific. A councillor may take up your questions shortly. Mr Jeffrey Love, please. Welcome, Mr Love.
Thank you, Mayor. Jeffrey Love, St Kilda, and thank you to the councillors and officers for hearing me tonight. EFLAG appreciates the formation of the Elster Creek Catchment project and the Community of Reference Group, which met for the first time this week. The action plan identifies many important actions that will mitigate flooding. We have a number of concerns. Firstly, the Elster Creek Catchment Plan has the whole catchment, including the whole of Elsternwick Park, north and south, to consider in its flood management plan. The creation of the Elsternwick Park North Working Group muddies the waters, deliberate water reference there, of responsibility for the flood mitigation in Elsternwick Park North, and the proposed sporting development in Elsternwick Park South raises further questions. There is no place in the governance structure for the Elsternwick, the Elster Catchment Management Plan for the Elsternwick Park North Group, and there's an overlapping of responsibilities for flood mitigation in the park, which the Elsternwick Park North Working Group divides into Elsternwick Park North and South, with no one responsible for South except possibly the overall. It's just a little confusing structurally, and we'd like that clarified. Or we'd ask the councillors and officers of the City Port Phillip to seek clarification from the larger group on the question of responsibility. Secondly, the question of coastal flooding must be addressed. We appreciate the installation of one-way valves in Elwood Canal has started. How many of the 32 recommended valves are to be installed? And also, what consideration is being given to the mouth of the canal? These coastal flooding is not really addressed in the catchment management plan, clearly. I note, in response to an answer given in public question time, the mention of the Coastal Hazards Vulnerability Assessment Plan, and point out that the City of Port Phillip doesn't currently have one, and I'd ask when we might expect one. However, I do note the City of Port Phillip's production of Bay Plan 2070, which does propose some practical adaptive measures, which I hope to see adopted. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr Love. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Baxter?
I thought I'd just take up all those questions from the last two speakers and wrap them up neatly. So the questions from Mr Herman about consultation processes and the release of content and transparency. And maybe we'll start with that, and then I'll put Mr Love's questions.
Mr Walters?
Through you, Madam Mayor. With reference to the detailed reports that arise from the work being done by the under the auspices of the Elster Creek Action Plan, the various elements are being led by various partners within the group, and in order to publish the information when it's completed, that will require a joint approach. So there is an absolute desire from us to offer full transparency, but the timing of that will depend on the comfort of the various partners in releasing the information that they are the custodians of. So there is an intent that we will pursue at that forum.
Councillor Gross?
Sorry, there was also a question there around the consultation.
Through you, Madam Mayor, sorry, Councillor Baxter. The question from Mr Herman related to consultation around flood management plans. Flood management plans are led by Melbourne Water. we've recently been in discussion. It's essentially our assets team is the responsible part of council that leads on flood management planning with Melbourne Water. So approaches have been made. There is, as Mr Herman said, a intent to have a catchment-wide flood management plan that is in sync with the municipal flood management plan, which is a statutory requirement that Melbourne Water leads, and that local or municipal flood management plan is a broader document than Elster Creek. So in answer to his question, the other flood affected areas of the City of Port Phillip will be taken up in that document. With respect to the timing of consultation, as it is led by Melbourne Water, we can't speculate on when that is. We understand that it is behind schedule, but Melbourne Water have a program of delivering all the required local flood management plans across their jurisdiction. They've got a program to get them completed soon, but I don't have the actual detail of that. It will obviously include detailed public consultation as part of that process.
Thank you, Mr Walters. Councillor Gross, you had a question as well.
Mr Walters and Mr Graffin, sorry, I've got some issues to ask about with the attachment. So I just thought I'd go through some of the words because they're very hard. So really this attachment's a very dense document and probably deserves much more thorough going through than we can do tonight. But it says in deliverable number 1, a 1% average reoccurrence interval flood extent. What does that mean?
Mr Graffin.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So the 1% is a flood event that could be expected to happen with a probability of 1% in any given year. It's a departure from previous language around recurrence intervals, which references 1 in 100s, but it's an equivalent sized event. The naming convention looks to distance it from that kind of language around how often you might see it in a given period and say what's the probability of it occurring in any given year.
Oh, I see. Oh, no, I understand that. Okay, that was good. Thanks, that's a help. The second one was average exceedance probability floods in deliverable 3.
So this is a throwback to the average exceedance, which is the other way of describing it. The reason that this exists in the document is because at the time of the 2011 GHD report, the accepted, I guess, vernacular for talking about flood events dealt with those, the terminology about the recurrence in a 1 in however many year event. So the two terms are a different way of describing how often you might expect to see a flood event of particular magnitude.
Right. The other thing I noticed in my trips down to the canal when it's been flooding is sometimes there's really complicated management responsibilities. So the last flood occurred because Vic Road's drains hadn't been cleared. Then there's our drains and then there's Melbourne Water drains. Is the management plan going to try and make sure all of the maintenance gets done and everyone knows who's doing what and to whom?
Through you, Madam Mayor, certainly that observation is accurate, that there are distributed responsibilities for the various drainage assets, and we will provide that feedback as input into the flood management plan to see it taken up. But it's also worth saying that Council has been proactive in recent times with respect to pursuing root cause in assets that are not our own. We've recently acquired the capacity to run a camera down drains, and in fact recently identified a drain blockage outside our own responsibility and sorted out getting it cleaned because the outcome was more important than deciding whose it was, frankly, and it was expedient. So there's this collaboration across various jurisdictional boundaries in the Broad is setting up a better environment for us to act sensibly with respect to these things. So I think we're in a good place in that regard.
And one other thing, with the app, that's the warning app, when do we expect the rollout of that, and what are the sort of information data points that'll trigger an alarm?
Through you, Madam Mayor. I'm not sure about the rollout. The app, is going through beta testing. I guess.
Oh, really?
There's a test environment that exists, and Melbourne Water, in their own words, are finding ways to break it at the moment before rolling it out publicly. They're worried about, the negativity that can be around rolling out software before it's prepared and before it's ready.
Sure.
I can, find out when the delivery process might be.
Thanks very much, Madam Mayor.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I've asked Melbourne Water to come and demonstrate the app to Council in its current state so that Council understand the functionality of that. My understanding in terms of rollout, Mr Graffin's correct, it will require some stress testing, and there are various options in terms of rolling it out in a small area or taking a bigger risk and rolling it out across the whole metropolitan area, and it also requires some further investment to support that rollout in terms of the back-end investment to support the data that's on the app. It will be an app which requires people to basically sign up to it, but it's got in terms of the demonstration that was given to CEOs at the last CEOs forum, it's got a very good functionality which I'm sure would be very useful to the community.
Thank you, Mr Smith. Councillor Baxter. Councillor Copsey.
There were just a couple more questions from Mr Herman and Mr Love that I wanted to take up. So I think I caught three more. One was regarding, Mr Herman referred to a recommended number of one-way valves and how many of those will be implemented.
Mr Walters.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'm afraid we'll have to take that one on notice and refer it back to our assets team for the progress report.
The second one was regarding coastal hazard management plan. Yes, and what's the delivery plan for that?
Again, sorry, through you, Madam Mayor, we'll have to take that on notice and get back to councillors with the planned, the dates around the government-led coastal hazard vulnerability assessment of which we are a part.
Ms Rosick, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, if I could add to that. I referred to that in an earlier question, and that's scheduled for 2021 to 2024, that piece of work, and it was referring to the state-led coastal hazard vulnerability assessment.
The third one was regarding governance arrangements and South and North Elster.
Mr Smith.
Through you, Madam Mayor, the CEO's group, which is the head of the part of the governance arrangement, were very clear that we should have two working groups, one on the broader Elster Creek Action Plan and one on Elster and Wet Park North. The point where they come together so that they're coordinated, so that we can consider issues in Elster and Wet Park South as opposed to Elster and Wet Park North as the CEO's group. The reason we had two working groups is one is likely to be a project, not involving potentially all of the members of the Elster Creek Partnership, but it was important that we got coordination across all the municipalities and Melbourne Water in terms of that project. So we've set up two project groups. One is for the action plan as a whole and the other is for the Elster Wet Park North project. But the point of coordination between the two is the CEO's forum, which I attend regularly.
Thank you. Councillor Baxter.
Councillor Copsey, you missed one. Mr Love also asked about the mouth of the canal and how that relates to our plans for the catchment area.
Through you, Madam Mayor. I understand Mr Love's question relates to protecting the canal from storm surge and filling up with respect to a tidal event when a riverine event occurs at the same time. So the logic there is tidal gates may buy some time. There's not a specific action identified in the action plan around the coastal, those type of tidal gates, but there is nonetheless the opportunity to raise that through the forum for consideration, and we have had some informal conversations with Melbourne Water around the effectiveness of that, and we will continue to pursue that idea and hope that they will take it up in their overall flood modelling. There's nothing committed in the actual action plan on it at this point in time, though.
Any further questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Baxter to move, Councillor Copsey to second. Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yeah, look, this is another update. I think that this is again something that's in a really exciting phase at the moment about how we're working together. I think it's a good document. I think it flows well, even if it muddies the waters. And I appreciate that some members. I can steal half. There were 2 puns in there. So I do hope that that any feelings by the community that they're being left out are managed as best we can. I understand that some of these documents have, multiple parents, and it's really difficult to manage that. So I'm just hoping that we can go ahead with that and continue on our merry way. I think we're doing really good work.
Thank you. Councillor Copsey.
Just to receive and thank the officers for the report. The attachment is technical, but the project is technical, and it's good to see that a lot of these deeper and more complex questions are now being considered as we move into cooperative phase of this project. I'll just note that we had a fantastic event at the start of this month where representatives of most of the partner organisations gathered together with community activists who have been working on the Elster Park advocacy project for some time, and just note that that was a wonderful day with so much energy and enthusiasm for the transformation that's going to be achieved there, and the benefits that can flow in terms of some of the project benefits that can also flow onto the catchment management. So I think it was really representative of the spirit of cooperation, and these updates are a fantastic way for us to maintain oversight and make sure that that enthusiasm is still being channelled into action. So thanks very much to the officers for the thorough update and to the community members for their interest in pursuing this.
Councillor Gross.
Look, I hate it when people just reiterate what's already been said, but I'm going to do that. But where's the excitement? This is fantastic. We've just added on our boundary this huge area of open space which can become a wetland, part of the flood mitigation, and be such a brilliant piece of open space for the Elwood community to enjoy. It's what's happening in this area is beyond my wildest dreams. Who'd have thought that the golf course would become much more accessible to the rest of the community? Once last year it had 12,000 golf visits. I reckon we'll knock that 12,000 off in a couple of spring weekends. The mover and seconder were at the opening, and of course appropriately said it was just fantastic, which it was. But if we go through this, as Councillor Copsey described it, a technically demanding attachment, which it is, to see the CEO's committee get all of these various parties working well, I just think, I'm just so hot, I'm sweating. I'm so excited, it's just rude. And I'm just, you know, it's not often that we get to a situation where councillors can say within 18 months of being elected that there's been this level of progress built on the work of predecessors, it has to be said. But it's really exciting. The Mayor went on a very successful visit to Melbourne Water, which I witnessed. Melbourne Water were progressive and advanced and generous with their views on the work that's been done in the catchment by all councils. This is a moment to be celebrated. But one cautionary note, I met a pretty eminent Elwood activist who didn't know anything about, you know, what are you doing in Elwood? You know, what's happening on Elwood? And I said, well, lots happening. So part of our brief must be to get this out there. I don't know how you do that easily, but I want to say to all of the officers, thank you, thank you, thank you, and to the CEO and the CEO's committee, thank you, and to all of the, it's a really successful process. Be happy, be loud, be proud.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. We'll be loud and proud. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Baxter, would you like to close? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. All right, now we'll move to 12.1, local law, clause for storing heavy vehicles and the adoption of it. Mr Rowan Cresp, only member of the public that's requested to speak to this one. Welcome.
Thank you.
Pop on the microphone.
Did it work?
That's
now?
it.
Rowan Cresp for Melbourne. First off, I'd just like to thank Fiona Blair, John Coates and Russell Brown for their work on advising the council here. I agree with what's been put here and I ask the council to support it. I only have one concern about how it actually be implemented and whether the permits can be just given out by council officers without proper consultation and even a veto from neighbours that are concerned about living near these heavy trucks. But that's the only thing I'm concerned about, and I hope you councillors will address that little part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Cresp. Councillor Simic, you have a question for Mr Cresp?
Mr Cresp, if you can just outline a little bit more about the concern that you have about the implementation of the permits. I'm not quite sure what your concern is.
My concern is this has been going on since 2004. When the council was told about this at one of the other meetings, it had only come to their attention from me with a petition. I'd even written a 29-page submission to the previous CEO with 9 gigabytes of data of truck movements. I've also had meetings with the council lawyers, with my wife, and they said there's nothing we can do. There is something you can do. We were told that the resident and landlord, it's not financially viable for recouping the cost of the broken gutters and damage that's down there. I'll go through the list if you want, but it's not worth it because they mightn't pay the bill. Like, we're not going to give them a fine because they're not going to pay the bill. This is your lawyer. Like, hang on, if I get a fine, I've got to pay it. And I just think there's something fishy went on there for a while. I'm concerned because that bin that is dragged along by the truck is usually a council bin coming from the council yard. Has there been some cost shifting going on? And council officers are seen going in and out of the residence. So my concern is it's stopping. I think your concern should be what's really gone on behind the scenes, but that's not something I really want to get into now to stop this going ahead. This is not just about me and this truck. There's other trucks all around the area that's happening, and as you get more developed in Fisherman's Bend and these things, even Jason Kelly, the Inspector of Police for the region, has said he's concerned about it as well for those things. So It's not just me. They are around. You can just drive around. I'll point them out to you. If it's okay with the neighbours and that's fine, well, they get a permit. Who cares? But if it's a problem, it shouldn't be. But those issues with the council officers, it's not you guys, but somebody in that group there has not really, I don't think, done the job properly. But anyway, we're here now. Hopefully you support this and we take one step forward.
Thank you, Mr Crisp. That's all. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Pearl.
Just wondering if the officers could address the concerns that were just raised by Mr Crisp in terms of the process of application, please.
Through you, Madam Mayor, certainly the application process envisages consultation with affected adjoining properties to ensure that any amenity concerns of those affected neighbours are considered in assessing an application, and that would include properties across the street from any affected or any applicant properties.
Mr Coates, if I can elaborate a little bit on that, it sort of seems a little subjective. So is there a percentage of people that might have to agree or disagree? How in practice do you need the whole street to object to getting a permit, or how is this going to actually work in practice?
Based on the intention of protecting the amenity of the area, the safety of the environment, I don't have a specific formula of amount of agreement for an application, but we would envisage that resistance to any such application would be a serious consideration for not allowing a permit. Certainly we have to also consider the assets in the street and damage to council roads and making sure that any such vehicle movement on and off properties doesn't damage that as well.
Councillor Crawford.
Mr Coates, given that a truck can be quite large, would the people consulted extend to the whole street, especially if it's one of the smaller streets, or is it really just the next door and the across, or it can be a bit broader depending on the size of the truck?
We haven't fully resolved the scope of consultation or notification of any applications, but initially we were thinking more immediate adjoining properties that would be affected.
Councillor Simic.
When will you resolve that point, or intend to resolve that point?
Within the next couple of weeks.
So when it's resolved, will it be before you get an application to consider implementing a local law in a particular location, or will it be along with it?
Well, we still have to go through the process of notifying of any changes to the local law, so we would have that resolved prior to the gazettal of the changed local law.
Councillor Simic.
Why was that not resolved in preparation of this report for Council to consider tonight?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's unfortunate that it hasn't been resolved, but my apologies, it hasn't been resolved.
Sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. It's not unusual that we haven't resolved this. Going down to that detail is quite operational, and the process will still be required to go to a gazettal. Just in relation to the consultation before, we would always take a conservative approach, so more is better than less as well.
Conservative in which way?
Sorry, just in relation
to
the
status quo or to change?
No, just in relation to the question around how wide the consultation would be. Mr Coates indicated that it would likely to be the neighbouring ones, and what I'm saying is that we would take a more conservative approach, and so we would consult wider in the street than just the residing directly next to where the truck might be located.
Through you, Madam Mayor, Ms Blair and Mr Coates, can you clarify the criteria which is disturb, annoy or disrupt adjacent property owners versus other property owners in the street? Because it may be that we consult with other property owners in the street, but the criteria is actually whether it will disrupt adjacent, which basically means the neighbours. Is that correct? I think that's to be. I'm just to be transparent.
Yes.
Any further questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Simic to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Pearl. Councillor Simic, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mr Cresp for bringing this petition to our attention and for officers considering it and coming with a recommendation before us tonight. I think it's really important that we address this issue head on, and I think that this step tonight goes towards that. Since joining council, I've talked a lot about truck movements in our municipality. It was a concern for me during the council campaign and continues to be a concern for me. We're a seaside community. We have very precious infrastructure and amenity that needs to be protected. And I think we need to be considering very carefully how trucks, particularly non-residential delivery trucks, travel through our municipality and the cost that has on the health, well-being and amenity of our community. So I fully support this step tonight and I urge other councillors to do the same.
Councillor Pearl? Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Right, we'll move to item 14.1, which is the Ferrars Street Education and Community Project Streetscape, and it's awarding the tender. There are no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? I have one question, actually two. Just wanted to go through, normally when we ask for a best and final offer, we expect it to decrease. In this case, it's increased substantially. Are you able to enlighten us around that item, please?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I might hand over to the project manager, Andrew Farrell, who can answer that question.
Through you, Madam Mayor. The difference between the initial tender closing and the best and final offer was with the initial tender, we actually only called for rates for the provisional items, mainly to do with contaminated soil. Through the process of the tender period, we actually clarified the quantities, so used the opportunity at the best and final offer to introduce the actual quantities to apply to the rate, which has resulted mostly into the increase there between the 2 points.
And this wasn't expected, the increase?
Through you, Madam Mayor. The increase in actual rate costs, the rates per unit was higher than we anticipated. The quantities were what we had expected in terms of the amount we're excavating out, remained the same.
Thank you. And one further question to me. I know this is about awarding of the tender, but I'm quite interested in the management of the works and how will it be conducted. I'm specifically interested in it being done in an orderly way, maybe section by section. Is that something of the planning or that you're doing rather than it sort of ripping up the whole thing all at once?
Through you again, Madam Mayor. No, exactly right. The preferred tender is actually demonstrated in the tender period, both their flexibility and commitment to break the works up into different work zones, primarily because it is a interaction point between both the primary school, just the regular footpath, the park and the nearby public transport station that essentially, and there is an attachment there showing the full scope of works that is at the moment intended to be broken into 4 or 5 different components just to minimise the impact around whether it's the school, whether it's to do with the vehicle movements on the knuckle, even with the completion coming soon with the park and this work starting, we've taken into consideration a fair amount of how that's going to happen during the tender evaluation and clarifications we sought.
Thank you, Mr Farrell. Does anyone else have any questions? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Gross to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Copsey. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Gross?
Just quickly to say, when I look at these tenders, I look for doing well on part one of the non-price issues, and there was clear in the allocation of the points and the weightings that the preferred tender was easily the most competent and reliable and had the capacities to meet the requirements of the specie. So part one was fulfilled, and the price, yes, I absolutely accept what the Mayor says about the initial tender response leading to a best and final offer that's higher, but in terms of the other preferred tenderers, other shortlisted tenderers, the preferred tenderer did well on price, so I'm happy to take the advice of officers.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak? Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? If not, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Now, item 14.2, and councillors, we actually don't have anyone else speaking to any of the rest of the reports, just to let you know, was the proposed discontinuance of sale of roads, Part R 3517, adjoining 316 to 320 St Kilda Road, St Kilda, and R 3257, abutting 91 to 95 Montague Street, South Melbourne. Do you have any questions of the officers on these items? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Bond to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross to second. Would you like to speak, Councillor Bond? Councillor Gross? No. Would anyone else like to speak? All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. 14.3, proposed discontinuance and sale of road abutting 26 Moore Street, Elwood. Any questions, councillors? We have a mover, Councillor Bond. Oh, question. Thank you, Councillor Gross.
So this is the one where there was an adverse possession. I just wanted to ask the officers about adverse possession in local government. And when does adverse possession apply and when does it not apply?
Thank you, Ms Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, through you. It applies, adverse possession will apply if the title does not contain the name, the City of Port Phillip.
Right.
So the registered proprietor needs to be the City of Port Phillip.
So in this case it was an uncompleted road, and so it was still in the name of the original subdivider.
However, because the road was identified on title, the title said road, and it was the name of the original subdivider, the fact that the road was written on the title therefore brought it into the play of the Local Government Act.
Right. Thanks very much. That clarifies it for me.
Thank you, Mr Carroll. Ms Hayes, could you pop off your microphone? Thank you.
If I can add to that, Ms Hayes was telling me earlier that our asset team are actually in the process of going through and identifying and transferring the title of all those roads that are currently sitting with the developer to transfer to council to reduce the occurrence of this happening in the future.
Thank you, Mr Carroll. Any other questions? Councillor Gross would like to move. Councillor Copsey would like to... Oh, you had a question. Yes, I'll allow the question. Yes.
Just a quick follow-up to that. I just wondered if there was an estimate on how long that process is going to take.
Ms Hayes.
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. We've been engaging with Land Data for a little while now, and it's not a speedy process, but it is underway, and it is designed to capture all these smaller pieces of land which are almost hidden until they're identified to us. So it's certainly with them. We've got some prices from them for doing the work. It's a laborious task, but we'd like to hope that it might be done within the next year.
Thank you. So we'll just go back to, so Councillor Grossi would like to move this. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond? Would you like to speak, Councillor Gross?
Look, I just want to make the point about an unconstructed road. So with an unconstructed road, it's treated far differently in the Local Government Act to every other lane and road, and particularly in terms of title. The title's still in the name of the original subdivider, maybe 100 years ago. I've got an unconstructed lane at the back of my house, and it's a very long lane too, and I've got a constructed lane, or one with a title, on the other side of my house. So,
you're just trying to get in cheaply.
No, you know, what a terrible aspersion to cast, Councillor Crawford. But the point is, the point is, we have to, I think, get this distinction happening regularly, and we also have to note that in this case we're not going to get any money for this lane by way of sale. An adverse possession will run.
Fast, we won't take money from you either.
Excuse me, Councillor
Sorry.
Crawford. Councillor Gross, have you finished? Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to the motion? Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. So 14.4 is the status of council decisions, the 7th of March until the 6th of June 2018. Councillors, any questions of the officers on this one? Councillor Copsey.
We had a question from, I wanted to take up a question from a community member who's unable to attend this evening, and it relates to the status of decisions regarding Middle Park Library. So if an officer is available to... Oh, great, thank you. I'll just put them three. It's basically three queries about a status update that the resident has requested.
I believe they've been answered, Councillor Copsey. You just want to make them transparent? Is that...
I'm not sure if they have been answered in the... Yeah, I undertook to ask them in the meeting. So it's great if those have been sent back to the resident, but they were regarding the progress of opening hours realignment being made available for community discussion, the evidence of implementation of a solution to library usage data collection, and an update on where that's at, and the children's section strengthening and an update on that.
Ms Jeffs.
Through you, Madam Mayor, so I can confirm that Mr Willett was provided with a response today. So I can update Council and the community on this. So the opening hours realignment, so there will be a public feedback opportunity on Have Your Say on Council's website, and that will be from mid to late next week. So there'll be an opportunity for people to have input into the opening hours for the Middle Park Library going forward. And there's also a facility for people to provide input via hard copy in library branches across the city. And you know there'll be a transparent public consultation process about those opening hours. In terms of the data collection, library staff are currently working with a vendor on the solution for the collection of branch visitor data. Now this is the door counter question that has been asked. And there's a bit of complexity around that because there's multiple entry points to the library. So we want to really make sure that we're counting people once.
Thank you, Ms Jeffs.
Finally, the children's section. So we have just clicked over into the new financial year, which creates a new budget for library books and other library resources, and so the team is acting on this quite quickly and doing a review of the children's section at Middle Park Library in conjunction with our whole library purchase. So that action is underway as well.
Thank you, Ms Jeffs. Councillor Gross, was that a question that you would like answered? No. Any other questions on this report, councillors? Councillor Copsey would like to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak?
Very quickly to say that this is a great document if you want to see, like Council did, where all of the decisions we make in the chamber are up to and whether they've been actioned. And I'm pleased to see that community members are actually reading the document and sending us through queries. So I recommend it to anyone who's keen to see how the decisions of this chamber are being implemented. And thank the officers for their diligence in preparing it.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Councillor Gross, would you like to speak?
No, thank you.
Councillor Baxter.
Look, I just want to say this is not something that we've always done. This is a relatively new way that we package up all these decisions and put them on display to show where we're at. And I think that council, particularly council decision making, is often so opaque and confusing for people, and it's often so made in the time that it is, and then 2 weeks later no one knows what happened. It all flows off into the ether, and this is one way that we can show to our community that we're still thinking about it, and here's how you can keep thinking about it, which is really important.
Any other speakers? If not, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Okay, 14.5 is the lifting of confidentiality status of information considered by Council in closed meetings of Council. Councillors, any questions of the officers? Councillor Gross.
What will this do, just to reiterate the question that was asked today, what will this do to our proportion of confidential versus open decisions? Will it change it in any way?
Thank you, Ms Bennett.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So it won't change the report that we provide regularly through the CEO's report in terms of performance when the resolutions were actually passed. However, what we will do is make sure that it's notated in each of the reports. So, for instance, if Council was to carry the further 8 resolutions that we have in the officer's report, that would mean that 6.3% of Council's resolutions would be still held in confidence. So at the moment that's sitting at 8.2%, but that's resolutions that you've passed, so it's the past tense.
Great, I'm happy to move.
I've got a couple of questions. Councillor Simic, a question? Yep.
When a resolution's made public, is the voting, if it's recorded by division, also made public?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes.
Councillor Pearl, did you have a question as well? Councillor Brand.
In briefings today, I just asked, in our discussions today, I just asked about what was being released about the South Melbourne Lifesaving Club, and somebody said something was being not released yet, and something was. I would just like to clarify what actually has been released as non-confidential now, and what other confidential matters are there for the Lifesaving Club project still confidential.
Through you, Madam Mayor, so we believe that the recommendation or the resolution of Council has been satisfied. So on that basis, the resolution would be released without Council needing to do anything further at the meeting tonight, but that's the resolution only, not the report. The report would remain in confidence at this point in time.
I have a question as well. It's around probably the mechanics or the physical. What does the community see in terms of these confidential reports? Where do they see them? How can they follow this through to actually go back If you could explain that, please, Ms Bennett.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So the intention is that what is released by Council tonight, which in this first report is essentially resolutions, the community would find that at the relevant page for which that item was considered on. So they would need to go back to using tonight's report as an index to when that item was considered, but it would form part of the formal record for that meeting. But we can certainly look at ways to make it easy for the community to navigate through that process.
Ms Bennett, would the link or the word say something like "now not confidential," or how could it stand out?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we haven't worked out the exact mechanics yet, but we'll certainly do our best to make it as clear and simple for people to navigate.
Thank you. Any other questions, councillors? Then I did hear that we have a mover, Councillor Gross, and a seconder, Councillor Pearl. Would you like to speak to this, Councillor Gross?
No, thank you.
Councillor Pearl, would anyone else? Councillor Baxter.
Look, I just think that again, this is a new thing that we're trialling. I remember having conversations with officers very early on in my term about how we deal with confidential decisions that we make, and I was pushing at the time for sunset clauses that that after a while they become unconfidential. And what has eventually happened is that the officers have decided the best thing to do is to do this regularly, which is to just put everything together and do unconfidentialise things in dumps, which I think is just as good. And I think it's a really important thing for us to be accountable to our community and make sure these decisions that we make are transparent. There are a lot of councils, and this is not us, but there are a lot of councils out there that make decisions in confidence, not because they need to, but because they want to minimise embarrassment or they want to hide how they vote. That definitely happens in councils probably all over the world. We've got nothing to be ashamed of. We're an exceptionally well-functioning councillor group and organisation, and that's why I think that we're quite proud to put our decisions out there, as long as it doesn't compromise any contracts or other things that we have to keep secret. So I'm very pleased that we're doing this, and a big thanks to Kylie Bennett for doing this work and getting us to this point, because she's done a great job.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Terrific. Okay, we'll move to 14.6, which is the outcomes of the Audit and Risk Committee meeting on the 10th of May and also the one on the 21st of June 2018, and a review of the Audit and Risk Committee Charter. Any questions, councillors, of the officers? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover of that or something different? Councillor Copsey to move. Councillor Baxter to second. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Copsey? Councillor Baxter. Would anyone else like to speak? Councillor Copsey.
I think our silence should be interpreted as any indication that the work contained in this item is not crucial and very important, and also, quite onerous. It's a huge organisation, and we take this responsibility seriously. I'd like to thank members of the Audit and Risk Committee for their thorough consideration and for the report this evening.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Right, we'll move on to 14.7, which is Assemblies of Councillors. Any questions, councillors? If not, do I have a mover? Councillor Pearl to move, Councillor Copsey to second. Councillor Pearl, would you like to speak? Councillor Copsey, would anyone else? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. We have item 15, which is notices of motion. There are none. Reports by councillor delegates. Councillors, any reports to make tonight? Councillor Copsey.
Last night we had one of the most excellent nights on the council calendar with the distribution of the Cultural Development Fund grants funds to the successful applicants this year. It was really fantastic. I wanted to thank the officers, especially Sharon Dawson, who puts so much work into this process each year. and to Carol for helping to convene, Ms Jeffs, for helping to convene a really wonderful evening. The Mayor and I were present, and we had some performances from recipients of last year's awards. Not only were they fantastic, but they represented the very high quality of work that gets produced through these awards. One of the ensembles performing last night, they were nominated for 4 Green Room Awards and actually received 3 Green Room Awards. It's just one of the projects that was funded last year. The recipients of this year's awards, the applications were absolutely a joy to read through, and I'm really looking forward to seeing them come to fruition over the next 12 months. There is a little bit of further work for the Cultural Development Fund Committee this year as a result of Council's decision to allocate an extra $50,000 to this grant stream in this financial year. There is an extra $50,000 of Cultural Development Fund to be distributed, and we're working to do that in as quick a timeframe as we can to get those funds into the hands of artists as well. Just close by saying thank you to the community members who have sat on that committee. They do an excellent and thorough job, and they bring a wealth of expertise to the task. So, yeah, we're going to see some beautiful art in Port Phillip, as we always do, and I'm very, very excited about it.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Any other reports, councillors? Okay, then we'll move to urgent business, and there is none. Move to confidential matters, number 18, and there is none. So that's the end of our meeting. There being no further business.